There's no school in the country that saw learning benefits from interactive whiteboards. They probably didn't hurt anybody unless they fell on you or something like that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Make It Mindful, the podcast where we explore how to keep schools relevant by looking through the lens of mindfulness and asking the question, what's really worth paying attention to here? My name is Seth Fleischauer. My co-host Lauren Pinto is on a break, but together we delve into the world of education by interviewing changemakers and focusing on practical, transformative solutions for teaching. This week, our guest is Justin Reich. Justin, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can you take a moment and just introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm Justin Reich. I'm a faculty member at MIT, where I study online learning and how teachers learn.
Excellent. And we met through a mutual contact, Jed Stefanowitz, who actually will be on the podcast soon. So it's going to be one of the episodes right after yours.
Terrific.
Yeah. He's a great guy, great conversation. And you and I had a great conversation when we talked about a month ago. What stood out to me the most in our conversation was the way that you seem to be a sober voice in the world of AI craze that looks at things a little bit with like a broader historical perspective, I think. And a lot of people are just like, oh, wow, here comes this technology. We're at the bottom of this hockey stick. We have to adapt it as soon as we can. And you had a bit of a different perspective there. And I'm wondering if you could kind of unpack that a little bit. I remember when I said that we were at the beginning of a hockey stick, you even had a different opinion on that, about whether or not we are actually at the beginning of a hockey stick when it comes to AI. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So there is not good theory that can be used to explain or predict AI development. We had a remarkable phenomenon where a particular class of tools that we call AI, generative pre-trained transformers, experienced a pretty substantial improvement in performance. That was the shift between GPT-3 and GPT 3.5. Probably none of your listeners ever heard of GPT-1. Probably none of your listeners ever heard of GPT-2. And there was a reason for that. They didn't work that well. They were okay. They did neat things. We build lots of stuff in computer science that do neat things, but you never heard of them because they weren't that interesting. Especially in terms of their societal impact, their scientific advancement was of interest. As best we understand it, between GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, OpenAI hoovered up all kinds of data. Lots and lots and lots of data, lots and lots of words, shoved it in the system, did whatever modeling thing they did, and this whole thing works a whole lot better. Their one thought then is, wow, look at this incredibly fast improvement between 2 and 3 and 3.5. This is just going to go on forever. That absolutely could happen, but there are also perfectly reasonable reasons to believe that it won't go on forever. So one thing that makes understanding this difficult is there's not good, well-established theory that explains why the volume of data that was added to GPT-3 led to the improvements in 3.5. There are not computer scientists out there that are publishing papers that are saying, okay, here are our outcome measures of performance. Here's the volume of input we did, in between these things. Therefore, we should predict continuous improvements based on this. So one is there's no theory. Two is it's not clear that there are giant sources of how much human text data is still out there. These systems have hoovered up all of the words on the internet, all of the words in the books. There's reporting now that these companies made tools that recorded the transcripts, turned YouTube videos into transcripts, things like that. Just finding zillions of human words. At some point, they're going to run out of human words. How much improvement can these systems have when you can't add additional human words? What's going to happen to these systems when AI generates lots of words on the internet, and now you have AI generated words training these systems? Maybe it won't be a problem, but maybe we find that the main source of improvement that we have for these systems is a resource that is not infinite. And then when you're in the middle of a change, it's very difficult to detect the difference between exponential growth and logarithmic growth. So exponential curves just go up. Logarithmic curves are flat, and then they go up, and then they become flat and asymptotic again. So it's entirely possible that the year of our Lord 2022 saw the low-hanging fruit gains of improving these systems, And we might find in the years or decades ahead that it's much, much harder to generate similar kinds of gains. I'm not saying that any of those cases are more likely than continued improvement, but the statement that we can be assured of exponential improvement in generative pre-trained transformers doesn't strike me as having great evidence behind it. Doesn't, or at least it doesn't strike me as having dispositive evidence behind it. That doesn't strike me as something you'd like count on for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's wise to look at the future of anything and view it with some skepticism about one particular outcome being the outcome we're headed for, right? So, and I think that that's astute, but I don't think that there's necessarily all that many people talking about that in education right now. It's more about just trying to adapt to this thing that's suddenly here, and that brings me to another thing that you said in our conversation. You were talking about how most ed tech is adoption tech. It arrives because someone has an intention, but this GPT, the generative AI, this is arrival tech. It just instantly appeared, and that school systems are not set up to adapt to arrival technology, such as calculators and the internet. I'm wondering, what does it look like to be set up for arrival technology?
Yeah, so the key distinction is that if you look over the last century of technology adoption in schools, going back to radio and film strips and all and interactive whiteboards, whatever you want, most of those technologies came into schools because somebody made a plan. They like set up a little committee and they evaluated a series of options and they made a purchasing decision. Like no, like there's never been a school where a kid like brought their own smart board into the classroom and was like, I'm just using this thing, guys, like get ready for it. So most technologies are adoption technologies. There have been a handful of what you might call arrival technologies, which are technologies that make the way in schools without that kind of vetting procurement process. Maybe calculators were like that in some places. There's some overlap between what cell phones did, although the development of cell phones as a technology that had a real impact on student learning had a pretty long time horizon. Like the first kids who carried handheld flip phones into class to like ubiquitous contemporary mobile phones. I don't know how many years that is, 10 years, 12 years, something like that. But GPT arrived quite quickly, more quickly probably than any other arrival technology that we've had before. And it's a real problem because the usual technologies absolutely can cause harm. Like you can buy things that make learning worse. Technologies also have opportunity costs. You can buy things where it was a waste of your time and money to buy that thing. There's no school in the country that saw learning benefits from interactive whiteboards. They probably didn't hurt anybody unless they fell on you or something like that. But it was just a waste of time. All the money that we spent buying those things, all the hours that people spent in training and things like that, all of that could have benefited learners more had it been devoted to all kinds of other things. So another thing to recognize is that in this particular moment in the history of American education, I mean, we've always had highly unequal school system. We have a really highly unequal school system in this moment where, if your listeners are affluent and live in comfortable neighborhoods, it's pretty likely that the school they send their kids to, they work at, are, could be really considered sort of like post-pandemic institutions. Like things are sort of basically fine. There are many schools in the country where the schools have long COVID, where they continue to struggle with the after effects, particularly around chronic absenteeism. That a whole bunch of students learned that they didn't have to go to school during the pandemic and they're not coming back. And it's causing huge problems for systems. There's lots of other huge problems for systems in terms of learning loss, unfinished learning, the fiscal cliff that's heading up, things like that. So you can imagine our education system as at least having like schools that are like pretty fine, and schools that really have some very serious challenges. So then in November of 2022, Sam Altman and his team at OpenAI invent a machine that can do all of the students' homework for them. There are going to be some schools where that starts showing up inside their schools, and then go, oh, this could be a real problem for learning. Like maybe it's a cheating problem, but it's a real problem for learning. If there's a bunch of exercises that we've historically given students that have been useful, meaningful learning activities for them to do, and now they have a way of bypassing doing those activities. And those schools can get working groups together. They can do professional learning. They can have people respond to the immediate revival. We have a team who's doing a bunch of interviews with teachers across the country to understand their experience of the pandemic. One of our early interviews with a woman who was on maternity leave in the fall of 2022, so came back in spring 2023. And the thing that caught her eye, those dates might be wrong, but she like shows up back at school, and all of her kids are on the Bing browser, and she's like, what is going on here? Like, who has ever opened up a Bing browser, let alone why are all my students on the Bing? She's just like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Like, the reason why you open the Bing browser is to download Chrome and install Google, and then you never go back to Bing again. But she eventually realized that Bing, because of it's by Microsoft, because of partnership with OpenAI, had access to GPT-4 and to DALL-E 3, and so her students had adopted it. Again, the school had not made a policy to have all the kids get on Bing. GPT arrived in Bing, Bing arrived in her classroom. No planning, no strategy, no professional development, no support, actually not even an awareness, because she kind of missed some of the key turns there of why that was happening. Affluent schools have discretionary resources of time, staff time, money to address these problems. Schools that have long COVID don't have that. All of their discretionary resources are spent like finding substitute teachers and dealing with mental health crisis and getting kids to show up to school and all these other kinds of things. We have other interviews with teachers, including in a paper that we just published called Generative AI in K-12, an MIT perspective, where we talked to teachers, basically this, like, the arrival of ChatGPT is the 47th most important problem on my list. I don't know, maybe my kids are using it to do assignments, maybe they're not, but there are so many things that I need to worry about before that could even begin to be on my radar. And then he says something like, oh, I would love to have a day of professional learning. There are no subs. There are no substitute teachers in my community. I can't take a day to do anything. Until the summer comes around and those kinds of, and then when the summer comes around, does my district have any money to stipend me to do these things or to provide professional learning opportunities? So that's the problem with arrival technologies. In whatever was the year of the smartboard craze, if there are schools that were having a tough time, they just didn't buy smartboards, and it didn't cause them any harm, and it didn't get them any gains. But the schools that don't have the resource to take on this challenge, they still have teachers who have to deal with students bypassing learning, all the other sort of problems that come with that, but they're not capable of responding to this arrival.
God, there's a lot there. I'm starting to just think about the problems that schools have. You listed off, some of the 46 that are above the arrival of ChatGPT, and I'm wondering, taking a step back, like, what do you see as the role of emerging technology in trying to solve some of these problems? Because a lot of these problems have been around for a while. Some of them are exacerbated during the pandemic and during this long COVID phase. Technology is something that is constantly evolving and adapting. It seems like it is creating a situation where there are new tools, one of which is AI, to potentially solve some of these problems. But do you see edtech? I mean, you're a professor of online learning. Which problems do you see are problems that can be solved with existing technologies and emerging technologies, and which ones are ones that just need old-fashioned human stuff?
I am not enthusiastic about almost any of the things that education technology developers are applying GPTs to in these first couple of years of their surgence. They're not quite resurgence. Their initial arrival on the scene. From my understanding of surveys and things like that, teachers aren't either. I think if you look at EdWeek and other organizations published studies of how much teachers are using these new tools, they're not using. There's a very, very small percentage of teachers who are particularly enthusiastic about new AI tools for their teaching practice. Dan Meyer has been doing remarkable work at his Substack, Math Worlds, explaining why. As a former math teacher, as a math education PhD, as a director of mathematics for a big ed tech, publishing firm, it's like, guys, there's no product market fit here. People are not building things that teachers actually want. I had a student of mine who went to the ASU GSV Air Show, the big sort of AI conference, and she had this great line, which was like, people were super excited at 9 o'clock in the morning. There was a lot of energy. There was a lot less energy by 2:30 in the morning. Like by the time people had seen their 15th chatbot, they were much less enthusiastic. And in fact, the people who were doing things that were not chatbots were the booths that sort of had the most attention. I think there are three big things that people have been trying to convince teachers might be a good idea. One are chatbots. This is, to me, obviously a bad idea. Nobody wants to talk to a computer. You don't want to learn by typing with your computer. I don't want to learn by typing with the computer. There might be a small proportion of people who, on topics they're really passionate about, are excited for learning chatbots. But I promise you that the vast majority of algebra students in middle schools and early high schools in the United States have zero interest talking to their computer about algebra. They actually have very little interest in learning algebra. The reason why they learn algebra is because they care about the relationship with their teacher. That is the primary connection they have to learning algebra. And particularly if there's a technology that disintermediates that relationship, it's not going to be of interest. Okay, the second thing that people have as an idea is lesson planning or unit planning. One of the very worst things that we do in the United States is we send 3.7 million teachers home every Sunday evening to write their own lesson plans. This is insane. It is not a good practice to send them all home to Google plate tectonics lesson plan. The system will not be improved by sending them home to type, write me a plate tectonics lesson plan into GPT or any of the skins like Magic AI or Magic School, whatever, to do that. When teachers the best way to help teachers teach is to give them really good base curriculum, and then in small groups in their community to modify those expert developed base curriculum for their own local populations. And there are other countries that do a much better job of integrating those kinds of resources into their educational systems. So it's like taking one of the worst parts of our system and being like, oh, we can make it a tiny bit better through AI. It's like the whole thing is a problem. You're like trying to, someone is out on a golf course with a wiffle ball bat, and you're like, oh, we can make the wiffle ball bat a little more efficient. Like, no, you just have the wrong solution to the problem. The third thing that people want to do is make teaching more efficient. I might have a personal bias against this because I have a very hard time having GPT do anything useful for me, but I know that other great, smart, professional people have things that help them. But I also am deeply suspicious of technologies that promise to make teachers' lives more efficient. I would love to do an interview study of people or just as a conceptual idea, think about this or go talk to people who've been in the classroom 15 or 20 years where there's been a lot of technology introduced and ask them, like, are you able to focus on more of the most important things in teaching because of the arrival of all of this technology? And I don't think there are going to be a lot of people who give you the answer yes. I also think there are some technologies that we've adopted under the rubric of efficiency that have gone on to do very different kinds of things in our system. So one is the Scantron machine. The Scantron machine, in some respects, made assessment much more efficient. It made assessment really different. I'm not sure we would all look back on the mass adoption of the Scantron machine as a thing that improved assessment in the United States. A more recent example are online gradebooks. So I think teachers were promised and schools were promised that online gradebooks would make schools more efficient. I think they've made parent-teacher communication really different. When I went last year to my new seventh graders middle school parent night, we all walked in, we did our usual 10, 15-minute rounds of all the classrooms. I remember doing these days when I was a high school history teacher, and I spent pretty much the whole time explaining people all the cool stuff that we were going to learn. And then I had something at the end, which was like, generally speaking, don't call me, because in ninth grade, it's your kid's job to figure out how to communicate with me. But if you need to, here's my email, here's my phone. In these meetings, we talked for 2 minutes about the curriculum, and then the next 12 minutes we're like, okay, so we have two online grade books. One's in Google Classroom and one's in PowerSchool. You'll see a whole bunch of zeros in there. These kinds of zeros means that I haven't graded the assignment yet, but these kinds of zeros means your student hasn't turned things in, and these kinds of zeros means your student is failing, and that's when you should call me. I happen to think this is not a good system. I think having parents have constant access to their kids' grades in real time is not good for learning. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because there probably is a minority of students for whom this does support really well. But I think on average, this is not a good idea. But more importantly than that, I don't think anyone planned this or designed this. I don't think any school system that has ever purchased an online gradebook has said to themselves, you know what we really need to do is we really need to refine parent-teacher communication and make sure that parents have constant surveillance over their kids' grades, and that this surveillance becomes the basis of communications between parents and teachers. So under the rubric of greater efficiency, we actually changed the system, and maybe we changed the system in a way that isn't such a good idea. So when I go to ed tech conferences, whatever, and I see the sort of keynote speakers out on the circuit, my sense is that the main kind of talk that they've settled on is how AI is going to make teaching more efficient. I think they've settled on how AI is going to make teaching more efficient versus like revolution and things like that, because there's just no evidence that anyone has built a learning tool with these things that actually helps improve learning. And efficiency is maybe a nice goal. So my message for schools is actually don't be efficient, be weird. To my mind, the best thing about these tools is that they generate nonsense. They generate funny, weird pictures. They say false things. They tell weird stories. They imagine crazy stuff. I think the best thing to do with the tools is like not try to think that you can use them to make stuff more efficient or better, but you can definitely make things weirder and funnier and kind of fun. It's very unusual to have a technology where we do not understand how it works. These generative pre-trained transformers, they have a phenomenon that we understand really well. We haven't talked about this. We probably should have. It's really important for educators to learn the basics of how these systems operate. The best resource for learning this, if you have an afternoon, is an essay by Stephen Wilcrom called "What is ChatGPT and How Does It Work?" And the most important thing you need to understand is that all GPTs do is, given a sequence of words, they predict another word. They know all of the words that were on the internet, and they know that alligator is closer to crocodile than alligator is to apple. GPT doesn't know what an alligator is, or what a crocodile is, or what an apple is, or what anything is. But it understands word frequencies. And it generates these kinds of sequences of words. Once you understand that, you understand why it does all the weird stuff that it does. And you can do a better job playing with it, exploring with it. And we have plenty of time to wait until the rest of the world changes to figure out how we need to make changes in schools.
All right, I want to go over what you said here, because some of it I agree with. Some of it I think there's maybe some nuances to pursue. I'm not sure we have the time to pursue all of them, but you were talking about like the use of it for tutors. You said that nobody wants to talk to a computer. I think that might evolve as students are given access to this technology and see its human-like qualities. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the widespread adoption of this technology is the social aspect of it, and whether we're approaching an age where we develop robot friends. And so I think that like younger people especially might feel differently about that. Lesson planning, I'm totally with you. I think that the system is broken, and I think that wiffle ball analogy is perfect. And teacher efficiency, I do think that that's where a lot of people have arrived. In my own work with talking to teachers about this, I'm not sure that that's really the what it's doing. I think that especially for more experienced teachers, that they have the decades of experience that they're looking back on and looking at it critically, and that some of these outputs look pretty good at first, and then they dive into it a little bit more, and they're like, but I don't know about this, I don't know about that, and I do think what I'm trying to do with these trainings is to encourage people to develop their own relationship to it. That is one that is going to be dependent on who they are and what they need help with, and the specific tools that they use and what those tools seem to be good at for them or not. Because the more knowledge that you have in a given area, the more critical you're going to be, the more that this regurgitated information that is just based on other information that's out there isn't necessarily going to be anything revelatory. But I do think that there's a growth mindset of using this as, like, another resource, like you would a teacher down the hall, like you would the teacher's lounge, like you would Google until it got broken with, ads and inability to actually find what you're looking for. And so I think that mindset that I encourage people to have is one of curiosity. What can this do? One of skepticism. Let me approach this with a healthy dose of media literacy to understand what the limitations are, and then one of a growth mindset. How can I use this as a tool to grow and get better? I'm wondering how you would. What you would tell teachers if, because this is out there, right? Like, yes, it's the 47th most important thing, but it's the first thing when it comes to like what ed tech is talking about, right? And what teacher conferences are talking about. So if you, as a final question, when you're talking to teachers, what is the mindset that you think that they should have when they're looking at AI in education?
Definitely the first thing that I encourage people to do is to find resources to help them understand how it actually works. That is just an essential precursor, because if you understand, it is not hard to understand the basics of the computational, to develop an intuition for the computational operations that are happening inside the system. And once you do that, you're much less likely to anthropomorphize these tools. You're better able to understand what they're doing. You might be better able to make predictions about what they do. So that is the very first thing. What this whole ecosystem of people interested in AI, I'm really shocked at how little they're doing to help people understand how these things actually work. Like I didn't understand. If I ran ASU GSV Air Show every hour on the hour, there'd be a session explaining how these things work, and you make sure that everybody can go and do it. If there's any professional development that your school is doing around AI, the first thing to do is to figure it out yourself, which you can totally do, or get some people to help you figure out how these things actually work. After that, I mean, I have a few other pieces of sort of generic advice. One of them is to follow the examples of the disciplines. That many times in education technology, we make some of our wisest decisions in schools when we say, like, well, I teach economics. How do economists use these tools? I teach history. How do historians use these tools? I teach science. How do scientists use these tools? And one nice thing that does is it gives us some time, because there are lots of disciplines that are not changing very quickly. There's a line in the paper that I mentioned to you before, generative AI and K-12 and MIT perspective, something like that, which says that computer science seems to be changing pretty rapidly. But I've actually really stepped back from that. Because I keep hearing computer science professors, CS1 professors, tell me things like, I let my students use co-pilots in the first 4 weeks of class, and now they're really confused. This was definitely worse. And I hear software engineers tell me things like, every hour saved by coding with a co-pilot will cost you an hour of quality assurance down the line. So there's really it is really hard to predict the future. I can't think of very many schools where you'd say, man, like a huge advantage we have is that we leapt on this thing early. There's just not, like, for certain kinds of schools and certain kinds of social contexts, maybe there are, but I don't think schools need to be a sector of society that's in a rush to pursue these kinds of things. I mean, the one thing that schools have to deal with really urgently, whether they want to or not, this is the problem of being in arrival technology, is what we call cheating, but might be better called sort of students bypassing cognition, students bypassing learning. And people who teach writing have a whole bunch of stuff to deal with. The main thing that I try to tell those teachers in schools about that is, you have been doing this for decades. We encounter technologies all the time that help people bypass learning. Spark put notes help people bypass reading. Encyclopedias help people bypass summaries. Calculators help people bypass computation. Google Translate helps people bypass language activities. Like, you as a faculty have the experience and wisdom in your communities to know what to do about these kinds of changes. You've got a whole new class of assignments and learning experiences that you got to modify. You got a whole new set of technologies you got to kind of figure out. But like the general principle is not foreign to schools, and communities have the resources to be able to deal with these things. And then I say play around with them because they're weird and kind of fun and they do stupid, silly stuff.
I love it. Thank you so much, Justin. Thanks for being here. Where would you like to point our listeners for finding you on the internet, if you do want them to?
We have a podcast called the Teach Lab Podcast. We just have an episode that came out, which is a talk that I gave to the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education in the fall. We'll probably publish some other things, mostly from teacher interviews there. And then I don't know. I guess I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and stuff like that, but I don't post that much these days because it's not as much fun as it used to be.
Yeah.
Oh, and I run a group at MIT, tsl.mit.edu, and we started putting a bunch of stuff at tsl.mit.edu/AI. So that's Teaching Systems Lab, tsl.mit.edu/AI is another place to find some things we're doing.
Awesome.
Seth, it was a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, for our listeners, we'll put those all in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, please do tell a friend, leave a review, leave a rating, follow us. Thank you as always to our editor, Lucas Salazar. And remember that if you'd like to bring positive change to education, you must first make it mindful. See you next time.